You know, the most fascinating thing about the 21st century, it's its unpredictabilityness, if there's a word I can use, because you never know which way things might go. So they do have a chance in that sort of context. But in reality, when you look at the geopolitical situation of the world, I don't think that they carry enough weight to be able to stop the guns either from Russia or from Ukraine. And this, as you know, comes at a very critical moment of the war, in that the Ukrainians have just launched their own counter offensive. And you wonder, what will this mission, this African peace mission, yield? And if you look at what actually happened today, is that while the African leaders were walking around Kyiv, paying their respects to a monument of the people who were killed in the first few days of the war, drones and sirens were ringing because there were attacks in some part of Kyiv. So you wonder what Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, President Ramaphosa, will be saying to Vladimir Putin this coming weekend when he sees him.
Yeah, one wonders indeed. And there's a lot of pressure on President Ramaphosa because of the difficult situation he found himself in over allegations by the Americans that he was allowing weapon shipments to go from South Africa to Russia. And then the forthcoming BRICS, as in Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa summit in South Africa this August, at which he is expected to allow the arrest of President Putin if he arrives under an ICC arrest warrant.
Yeah, that's the big predicament for Cyril Ramaphosa. And he is wondering how he's going to square that circle, because South Africa adopted the Rome Statute, which is the law that governs the International Criminal Court, as its domestic law. So it was passed in Parliament. So in other words, the ICC law that has a warrant of arrest over Mr. Putin is the same law as the South African government that is using in its day-to-day governing of the country. So if it does not arrest Mr. Putin, it means it is not implementing its own law. So that will be unconstitutional, because South Africa is a constitutional democracy. So this is a very difficult situation, but not only for Mr. Ramaphosa. I mean, we're talking about the African Peace Mission now, granted, but this is a big, big predicament for the rest of the world, because in part, the Ukrainian trade and grain affects many countries, particularly in the developing world. So it is in the interest of Africans, not just South Africa, people who receive the grain from Ukraine, from Odessa, to make sure that the guns fall silent in Ukraine, because they need that grain. They do not have the capacity to produce their own. And we all know what happened to the energy crisis across the world. The cost of living is not just in the UK, that cost of living is high. It's high everywhere. And so it's in the interest of everyone on the planet to make sure that this war comes to an end, and it comes to an end soon. So Mr. Ramaphosa is doing his bit. Remember, he's got a track record of being a top negotiator. He negotiated the end of apartheid while he was working under Nelson Mandela. And by that, they averted a bloodbath here, a racial bloodbath, which was really, South Africa was on the precipice in the mid-90s. But Mr. Ramaphosa successfully negotiated with the apartheid government for them to leave power peacefully without the barrel of the gun.
Well, he's going to have to bring all of that heft then, Milton.
Of success.
Indeed, he's going to have to bring all that heft to this negotiation, this African peace plan. But when you look at some of the headlines, you know, a de-escalation of the situation, troops being pulled back, the removal of tactical weapons, the suspension of the ICC arrest warrant, one wonders how credible a menu it is if the Ukrainians don't see on that the restoration of their territorial integrity.
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to achieve it. In fact, being an eternal optimist myself, or I always look on the bright side of life, but sometimes you have to be realistic. The tanks that the Americans have promised the Ukrainians are still on their way to Ukraine.
Yes.
And the training of the tank drivers and the pilots of the fighter jets are still the training is they're undergoing the training now. So you wonder how this African peace mission can stop all of that military war complex, as they say. That there are so many parties involved in this that probably the people who have leverage are the Chinese. And I haven't seen anything from Mr. Xi Jinping that seems to resemble anything close to what Cyril Ramaphosa is trying to do.
And then Cyril Ramaphosa and his fellow presidents from Zambia and Senegal and the Comoros and leaders from Egypt and Congo, Brazzaville and Uganda will go to St. Petersburg. I think they'll be there by tomorrow to meet President Putin, who's hosting some kind of international economic summit. One wonders how the message will differ when they meet President Putin and talk to him face to face.
Yeah, it's going to be a hard one because, as you know, South Africa has got its own problems about its non-aligned stance on the war. And, you know, this is very interesting. I was reading today that, Desmond Tutu once said that there is a special place in hell for people who remain neutral in a moral dilemma.
Yes.
Okay. So South Africa has chosen to remain neutral in this war, so it says. But there are many people who believe that they are not neutral. They're actually leaning their support towards Russia. And because of historical ties, remember under apartheid, when everybody had turned their back on South Africa and they were supporting the white minority regime here, Russia stood out for South Africa. And that is what people remember. And that's where the importance of history, because sometimes you may think people have lost their minds. You're wondering, why is South Africa not just following the rest of the world and just supporting Ukraine? But they remember that they were never invaded by Russia. They were never colonized by Russia. And the countries that colonized are now urging South Africa to follow them into their own geopolitical sphere. So there is also this shift. Henry, you would know this. This is a big debate here. There's a big shift that this whole thing about a multipolar world where no one superpower is governing over everyone. And people who come from a history of apartheid and colonialism, they don't want a repeat of the same thing. They don't want to be told what to do every day, even if they are poor and they still need all the trade from America and the EU. They still feel that their dignity should be able to withstand and protect their constitutional right to choose who they want to be, freedom of association. So now you are being told your friend cannot be Russia because we're selling you Google and Apple products. So people feel like they are being treated as commodities. So it's a very complex matter, this.
It is, and just briefly to conclude, it plays quite neatly into Africa's demand to have a much louder voice at the United Nations and in other international fora.
Oh, yes, you can imagine there's this association of all the countries there. They meet as a club at the UN in New York every September. And the continent that has 1 billion plus people has no say in the Security Council, in the Permanent Security Council. So all these issues are coming to the fore through this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But there is also a simple logical thing. South Africa has battled to even just acknowledge that there's an invasion. They call it a conflict, a war. They don't acknowledge that Russia invaded Ukraine and that Ukraine is a sovereign country. And there is also, Henry, in terms of history, Ukraine has a good history of supporting the anti-apartheid struggle. They, for instance, introduced the 21st of March at the UN to be a human rights day, to be a recognized human rights day. And that is because here in South Africa in the 60s, there was a huge massacre by the apartheid government on the 21st of March. So Ukraine has not just been there in the USSR. It as Ukraine itself, supported the anti-apartheid struggle just as Moscow did.